presentation when they're ready.
Okay, just making sure I'm audible.
Yep, you are.
Look, I obviously know significantly less than Sarah about this specific issue. However, we're going to use analysis to explain to you why this policy specifically is likely to fail and harm the American market itself at the same time, and also going to lead to a retaliation by China that is going to be very problematic. Before that, 3 extraneous points of rebuttal. 1, the entire point about intellectual property might have been true for a reason not to sell to China in the first place. As things stand at the moment, we believe, given that China has already bought large amounts of these semiconductors through either directly when these sanctions were not in place, or through external and through third-party entities, like Sara says, is the status quo. We believe that they have already done most of the damage in the sense of taking away those IP and so on. We just don't think, we think you're closing the floodgate way too late, and it doesn't actually produce any of the benefits that opening government wants to claim, or at least the great majority of them are not produced. Secondly, they say it's really important for US companies to be able to sell this because it's a huge investment to produce these semiconductors, the infrastructure for them, and so on. That tells us 2 things. 1, without this profit, they are going to be significantly harmed. We're not saying they will necessarily collapse or go below the bankruptcy line. We are saying that this is a huge market share that they will not be able to access. We're saying that when such a huge market share exists, it is very likely that other companies are going to try and monopolize and capitalize on that. We're going to explain that in my first point. But then also we say that these companies also have a huge incentive to pass their operations outside of the US. So for example, given that they have the IP, they are able to produce the infrastructure themselves, either in Europe or in the Far East or in the Middle East, anywhere else where they are not subject to this legislation, which means you have both made no gains, meaning you have not solved the collective action problem through that, and you have created mass losses for your own economy. We believe that's bad. Finally, they say Chinese companies are going to disassociate themselves with the government because it's so important to them, from the Chinese government, because it's so important to them to be economically viable. That is absurd. Like, even if knowing very little about these specific Chinese companies, the fact is if a Chinese company goes against the Chinese government, they are likely to just be disbanded. People are likely to get arrested. That is a much greater threat than not being sold some semiconductors to. Therefore, we just think that is highly unlikely to happen. Let's talk about why this fails and harms the American market. First of all, just a second. Currently, a lot of what the US produces is over surplus that is going specifically to the Chinese market. We believe China is the greatest consumer of most of these products, given the fact that that is the largest growing technological market, given that it's a nation of over 1.5 billion people, and therefore we say that the cost of this infrastructure is something that is, on the one hand, large. China doesn't want to do it on itself, but it is possible for China to do this. Why? First of all, because, as I've said, they've stolen most of our IP already. Secondly, because they have a lot of their own technological innovation and science in which they can improve upon what they have already stolen. And they have amazing capacity in terms of setting up specifically infrastructure. They have built hospitals within a matter of days. We believe they are able to do this. If we give them an alternative, the likely scenario is they are going to produce these things themselves. So what actually happens? China sets up this infrastructure on its own, and they start competing with you on other international markets as well. Given the fact that producing things in China is significantly cheaper than it is to produce things in the West, it is likely that they also are able to capture significant portions of the market used to belong to you. What does that mean? First of all, it just means some of these companies, US companies, do go bankrupt or do have to cut down significantly on the ability of them to produce, even for the internal market. Given the analysis we get from Olja themselves, it says it's a high setup cost, and therefore you need a lot of cells in order for this to be economically viable. Secondly, as we say, some of these just move abroad. US loses that capacity as well. What this means at the end of the day is it is in the competition against China in terms of producing strong AI, 5G technologies, all the things that will actually shape the future of who wins the new technological race. We have slowed down the US more than we have China, and we believe that's a worse alternative in terms of what the essential thing governments want to achieve is. Before I go on, I will take a point from closing if they have one.
So at one point in your rebuttals, you suggest that this move is going to cripple Chinese companies, damage them quite severely. On the other hand, you are now suggesting that they can recover.
No, I've said this will cripple US companies. No, you just misunderstood me. I've said this will cripple US companies. I've never said it will cripple Chinese companies. I've said that Chinese companies will not disassociate themselves from the Chinese government, but the part about crippling was about the US. Okay, let's talk about how China is likely to respond. First of all, OG tries to shirk that away by saying, we already do this, it isn't such a big deal. On the other hand, in order to claim any efficacy for their motion, they have to claim that we do this significantly more now, or we do this in a way that influences China significantly more. So we don't think China can just brush this under the rug. This is quite an aggressive, firstly, quite an aggressive action against the Chinese market, specifically against the strongest national narrative of the West is trying to stop Chinese development and Chinese prosperity, which is tied back to a history of colonialism in the 19th century. We believe that is specifically something in which Chinese nationalism is going to retaliate quite massively. Secondly, we say that given that the people who are involved with this field, with technological fields, will know that this action happened. Therefore, this sets a very strong and dangerous precedent for China in the sense that other companies and other countries in Europe, around the Belt and Road Initiative, are testing their resilience and their willingness, their resolve and their willingness to do things and act on a constant basis. Therefore, we believe they have to respond. Thirdly, we're in a position right now where the US in a specifically vulnerable position, where they're both in political instability, but most importantly, are suffering massively from the COVID-19, in which China has been able to contain to an extent through massive quarantine policy that the US is unable to do. What does all that mean? It means that China will be forced to respond, and will be able to respond quite effectively. What does that look like? It looks like, first of all, raising tariffs and tariffs back against US products. That's just something that impoverishes more people on both sides. We believe that's bad. Secondly, selling away of some US bonds in order to stabilize the US situation further, meddling in US election, escalating other conflicts such as the South China Sea, such as around North Korea. We believe all these things are levers they have to use to an extent in order specifically to retaliate and show that this will not go unanswered, even if they are able to sustain the damages. Therefore, we are very proud to oppose the motion. Thank you very much.
Then the Leader of Opposition, Deputy Prime Minister, when you're ready.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are.
Lovely. Okay, I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so again, I obviously also know less about this than my partner, but I think that what is important is that we do understand how international international relations kind of work, and why it is that kind of and also more importantly how actual research into semiconductor and technology work, which is something that unfortunately Ayal and Schulman don't know that much about. And a lot of their characterizations when they talk about this kind of point to that. I think they don't actually understand what it is, like the gap that exists between the US and the China currently, why it is that China simply can't like magically do this, because if they would have done this already, and also the fact that they've been trying to do this for 2 years without any real success. What we think that needs to be happening here is 3 things. We're going to explain to you why it is that China is very likely to simply agree to this, stop interfering and lift the ban, because I think crucially Ayal missed that we weren't saying how we would necessarily agree to this, but why the Chinese government would be pressured into doing that. We're going to talk about the harms to business and also the controls, and also the idea of spying, which we didn't receive any answer to. So before we go into this, there's a couple of things that's worth clarifying. So just in the term of framing, Ayal's like, aha, but you have to propose a big change to the status quo, or otherwise you can't claim your impact. Mate, we didn't set the motion, right? I'm sorry that the CA team didn't know how much of their motion was already actually status quo, but that's the reality that we need to deal with. We are extending this to additional places and additional companies, but notice this is just a trajectory that's already existed. This means this does dampen the amount, this does dampen all of the backlash stuff and everything that they're talking about, and we've actually pointed to how this has actually been very, very effective, i.e. the EU, Britain, all of these countries are also putting in their own bannings of Huawei today, currently. This is all status quo and it's kind of built in, and actually shows how effective this has been in kind of cornering the Chinese out of it. The precedent has been set, everything's happened, we're dealing with what's happening, we're simply expanding what's going on. They need to meet us in reality. So then let's talk about why is China like it. So first of all, I just want to kind of discuss this idea that Ayal just throws out that nonchalantly, they'll simply develop this themselves and they'll compete with the US companies. Okay, mate. This isn't about manufacturing, and this is where Ayal gets mixed up. He's like, oh, it's much cheaper to manufacture stuff in China. That doesn't matter. What you need in order to be able to do this is like the most cutting high-tech technology in the world. This requires like massive R&D investment, the greatest scientific minds, the best universities in order to think of that, in order to develop this. And it also needs to be like ability and people who want to come to your country, like the best minds in the world in order to do that. People want to come to people want to come to America and learn and study there and work in American companies, which are the biggest companies in the world. And then you look at the biggest companies in the world, like the biggest companies in the stock market, everywhere else, that in like 90% in the US, they're not in China currently. Like the R&D development, the biggest part of them, they're all in the US. Even in Chinese companies, a lot of them exist in the US simply because that's where the best scientific minds are. And that's like the kind of bubble that creates additional things in which what pushes forward. It's not about the manufacturing stuff, which might be cheaper in China. It's about where the actual brains exist and the nuance exists in order to develop this technology further. And also there's this international desire. Companies need to move into your place in order to do this. Like you need to be able to track minds. People don't want to move to China. International people don't want to move to China because of government interference and because of like the lack of IP control. These are all things which mean that China makes it very, very unlikely that they can simply like switch this out. Note that they've been trying to do this for 2 years, and like they have 16% of the Chinese market, right, is controlled by Huawei. Everyone else uses the American products because they are superior. So it's simply not able. They're simply not able to pretend that this can happen. So why is therefore likely? So the bottom line here is that we think that what happens is the Chinese government disinvolves itself majorly with the big companies like Huawei and then we lift the ban. Why is this true? A, because China is weakened by tariffs currently. Its economy is weakened by COVID. It's internationally weakened by COVID as well, and like its international stage. And high tech is hugely important for it to move its stuff forward. Note that specifically, like it's not true that Ayal says like but like the harm to the U.S. economy. Look. The US economy, which is much more based on all of the things that we said as R&D and high-tech companies, note that the stock market is at an all-time high, high-tech companies are at an all-time high inside the stock market. All of this is because they can continue working even during COVID, and COVID points to the fact that there needs to be better ways of getting information across and like using technology better, all of which already exists in the US, right? So this is why like the American economy actually is is much less impacted by this than say like China, which is built much more on the manufacturing at this point of stage, which is much more difficult to manage because you need everyone inside the factory together, and that's why you get COVID. China, by dealing with this, by mass close down a lot of their factories, harming their economy even more. This is why there's even greater imperative and greater incentive to them to want to play ball here, because they do want their companies to have access to this technology, because they do want the economic gain. They do want the international recognition. They do want Huawei to be able to sell to other EU countries. They want to be able to build that infrastructure, those ties. Those are all things which are good for this internationally and diplomatically in order to do. But they can't do that so long as this ban is, and they can't create a proper replacement. They certainly can't do it in time to deal with this, because also no technology, like they say, but this damage has already been done. The technology is constantly developing. Even if they backward engineer what happened like 2 years ago, which is when the ban was first put in place, the technology is developing. 5G already requires new semiconductors, which we simply haven't implemented yet, and like new semiconductors to work en masse, which is currently being developed inside the US. China will never get access to them. That means they can never compete with them. They can never do the things that they want to do. This is why China is very, very likely to agree to this, and the damages both to economy, both to the American companies and to the economy as well, is very small. But let's talk about the actual damages that happen inside today. Look, the first of all is huge harms to businesses, like which haven't already occurred, which is like simply the fact that like there's a huge amount of money put into investing in this technology, and then the Chinese company rips me off and sells me at a lower price. This harms all of the US businesses that goes out. That's much bigger harm to the US economy overall, because it means they're competing on an unfair playing field and losing out to what happens inside China. And then that means that while we're investing in developing new technology, China is ripping it off and creating new things. Before I move on, and by the way, this impact gets weighed up against the fact of a short-term shock to the system, which then corrects itself over time. So even if we don't end up selling to China, at least we're not, as Sara points out, having to sell to China and then shoot ourselves in the foot. I'm going to take closing.
There are already imposed cooperation limitations by companies like Google with Huawei. We're banning things like TikTok in the USA currently. Could you please give me an example of the concessions you think we're currently getting from China because of that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the current war that's going on with us between China is something which is pushing China to become less involved and diverge itself from certain companies. We think that this is a process that is happening. We think the analysis points out to why it's happening. I'm happy for you to say that it takes longer time. We don't care. Cool. Let's talk about then the second major damage that happens here, which is about spying. Because note also that the technology that's being used, when we give them better technology and we allow them to compete with ourselves and to undersell us and to get into sell to our allies and sell to our people and everything else. This means that then you put a Huawei phone into the hands of an American, in the hands of a European, to the CEO of a big company. You put their infrastructure into all of these different places as well. What that means is that, note, while the Chinese government is still directly involved in there, they're just sending all of that information back home. It's isn't even a secret anymore. Once I wouldn't be able to say this publicly. Now everyone knows it, right? They're sending all of this information back home. This is a spy apparatus for the Chinese government. So this hugely impacts our ability going forward to protect our IP because we can't do this, and the Chinese government is very implemented to do this. But two, it also interrupts like our diplomatic purposes and our ability to like wage wars or anything else with the Chinese constantly spying on us in places where we don't have the same right to things of opinion. This is a massive additional tool to give to China for literally no reason to do this. Thank you very much.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister and I welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Just a second.
Yep, no worries.
Yeah, okay. 1, 2, 3, go. I'll do two things in my speech. One, we'll talk more deeply about the US-China relationships and economies, and then we'll talk about the developing world as a secondary as a secondary impact of this motion. And please notice the motion doesn't say this House as the United States. It says that believes the United States should do it. So other people being harmed is crucial. Let's talk first of all about the US-China relation, because look, the problem with OG is that they keep on telling us, oh, you see, China would just stop stealing our IP. We really don't understand why they would. They, in fact, do not answer our points. Let's go through it one by one. We have given you multiple alternatives to what China could do. One, we said that they could start developing it in-house. Now, OG says, but they wouldn't have the cutting-edge technology. Sure, but China was never about having the cutting-edge technology. They were about giving you cheaper products that aren't as good as the best you can buy, but it's the best you can buy for your buck. Why is that crucial? Because that means that they don't need to have the best semiconductors. They need to have good enough semiconductors. And that is not something that is being clear to us why they cannot develop, given A, China has pretty good universities and pretty good technology in and of themselves. B, they have huge amount of years of doing reverse engineering on your semiconductors. And three, they can still do it today. In order to reverse engineer a semiconductor, you don't need to buy that semiconductor yourself, and you don't need to buy billions of it. You just need to buy like 10, and we're pretty sure China can get 10 of them, even if you bet. And they said, okay, but OG, then we have given a few other options. We said that maybe China would just move on to using semiconductors made by other countries, say by South Korea, by Japan, by the EU. To which we said, no, we think they will all go with the US. Why? No one answers. This is a huge market they could tap into. Why would they give it up? Thirdly, we said American companies would move abroad and just continue selling to China. They said, no, but American companies like it in America. Okay, but the singular American company that moves abroad gains the entirety of the Chinese market. This is a huge, huge incentive for them to move. Then fourthly, we said China would just be more aggressive towards the US, and we've given you several ways in which that is done. OG to this said two things. A, we are already doing some of this today, and China didn't go apeshit. A, China also didn't stop stealing IP, so we don't really sure what that has to do with the debate. But B, we just think that COVID just put the whole game for a hold on a while, but China is actually resuming doing it right now. There was a trade war with the US. It frankly never ended. And please notice, if you ask who is stronger in the trade war, right now China is. Why? Because contrary to what we heard from OG, yes, China was weakened by COVID. The US is still having COVID. They still haven't opened up. They have never even came close to flattening the curve. It's only on the rise. So, and the US has an election coming up, which is going to turn the whole country upside down, because you don't know what a new president might do. And if Trump goes on, that's even worse. The point is that the US does not have the ability to say, oh, we're stronger than China on this one. Let's play the game of chicken and see who backs down first. The US will back down first. They will damage the economy of themselves and China while they're doing so, and this would be worse for everyone. But let's say even everything they said is true. Okay, then you need to punish China for stealing your IP. But why this way? Maybe you should ban their products. Maybe you should have larger tariffs. Why this specific way of punishing them, given all the damages that we've shown? This is something we've never heard. This is something that we need to hear from CE. But let's move on to the effects on the developing world. Look, this is very crucial. Huawei and Tencent and other Chinese companies do a lot of their marketing to the third world. If you were to go to almost any country in Africa, you would find the vast majority of the population, A, having a smartphone, which is pretty great, but B, having a Chinese smartphone because they are significantly cheaper than anything that happens in the West. Now, let's say we take OG at their best, and China stops stealing IP. They can't have those semiconductors anymore, and so on. That means they need to jack up the prices because they can't produce as much, or they need to spend a lot of money on R&D, which means all their products are now a lot more expensive. Probably too expensive for someone in the developing world to actually purchase. Now, this is horrifying because in the developing world, phones are critical. They're usually your only way to communicate with the world and have access to the internet. Usually they operate as credit cards, so this is the way that you have a trade. Many schools operate based on phones because this is the way teachers can teach remotely from other places. And there are many work opportunities that you can only have with a phone. Say, being an Uber, say, doing Zoom meetings as a lawyer, which are professions that also exist in the developing world. The point is that that maybe the US and China would be fine. We don't think that is true. But the developing world, which is going to have significantly higher products for things that is crucial to them, is going to be subjected to huge harms on their side. Let's take opening up.
Developing world is uncomparative by the analysis that Schulman gives us. They will buy the cheaper product from China, which they can continue to create. By not selling them the semiconductors, they can't sell to the European markets and spy on them. Not by backwards engineering, but by simply giving phones into the hands of CEOs.
Okay, Benji, but consider what if this motion was implemented 10 years ago? Then they would buy phones that have no connection to the internet, and they would be stuck with those phones until today. As you told us yourself, since technology is ever evolving, the developing world also needs to be evolving with it, otherwise the phones become meaningless to them. Finally, let's put all phones aside and talk about other stuff. The problem is that there are also other things that China sells. So, for example, you use those semiconductors for monitoring water pipes in desert places, for monitoring transport in ports, for spreading education resources. All those are very basic things that you cannot do, even if the people themselves could somehow have cheaper phones. Finally, why we think that the West wouldn't step in and take over this market from China? So the West isn't interested. There isn't enough money to be made given the amount of R&D that the West has put into those phones. And B, they're very afraid that those countries would act as China proxies and actually just take technology using that. So it would harm China and the US. It would harm the developing world. We beg you to oppose.
Take the Deputy Leader of Opposition and welcome the government member, the opposition member.
Can you hear me?
Yep, all good.
Okay, 1 second. I'll be starting in 3, 2. Before showing why this policy will indefinitely prolong the trade war, a lot of rebuttal to both governments because they're quite confused here. First of all, in terms of Chinese access to technology and our communication networks, open government, we're living in 2020. I don't work this job like Sara, but what I do know is that the current capacity of governments to hack into technologies, into communication networks and computer networks, and access patents even without their consent is quite large. We've seen quite correct indications that Russia has been stealing information from the European Union to produce the COVID-19 vaccine. I think the CCP is somewhat more developed than Russia is in terms of those capacities. Secondly, the only thing it takes is a whistleblower or a leaker within a company who seems to think that the United States capitalism should be destroyed. We have enough of these wackos. Julian Assange is one of them. That the technology gets leaked to a Chinese informant, and therefore China still gets to produce genetic material. Another example is like the Russian collusion in the US elections, where essentially they hacked the election system, and we still could not find conclusive evidence that they did because they were able to hide their tracks So, well, best case for open government is to slow the process down somewhat, but the harms are going to incur anyway. That's marginal. But secondly, given that the status quo, and Ayal is correct to point this out, is we're already imposing limitations on Huawei, TikTok, and so forth, and so on and so forth, is that we are seeing no change and no concrete concessions from China. Benji's response to my POI is, we are seeing a process of China being less involved. This sentence doesn't mean anything. Even if it's said in a convincing tone by a reputable speaker, still doesn't mean anything. We're still having a trade war. China is not backing down it. Why? Because the Chinese economy was never primarily tied to the tech industry, right? It was primarily tied and still is to cheap exports and price dumping into the Western markets. China still trades with the European Union. It still has 60 BRI countries under its influence, control over their raw resources and infrastructure. They will not collapse because of this policy. So there's very little change from OG, and also no fulfillment of the complicity principle for closing government. And finally, OG says spying, CG has the same case, but with a little bit more outrage and the word complicity. I've had it with these cases. China bad actor, oh, China will kill us. I don't care if China spies on me or the US spies on me. Today, we use fucking social media that has algorithms which track our preferences and limit the amount of content we can see. Facebook sells our metadata to Google, who targets advertisements to us in subliminal ways and makes us buy things we don't need. The Patriot Act allows the USA to hack into our phones, but also means that the USA has deals with companies like Yahoo to literally also get our metadata and can cross-reference our preferences and create profiles of who we are. I don't care if the US spies on me or China spies on me. We're spied on anyway. This therefore means on both sides, to the extent to which you have any tech companies, you're complicit in shit, and closing government is out. But now, on the actual extension, we say that the trade war with China is likely to continue if you have this policy. Because if you impose this policy, and it's always a policy of crippling, like, China's tech giants. This means in order to be consistent with the policy, you need to get other restrictions on China, which means that you're continuing the trade war. First of all, why do we think China is likely to win any trade war and China can outlast us? Bunch of reasons. First of all, China has a huge internal market. It literally has more than 1 billion people, like diversified internal market in terms of like technology, in terms of agriculture and industry. The taxation and the transactions within the Chinese market are more than the entire EU combined, which means that the circulation of money exists in China anyway. Secondly, the BRI means China has dozens of trade partners, but also controls their raw materials and their infrastructure, which gets leased out to China when these people cannot pay back their loans. This means they control like vital strategic trade routes all around the world. This means they can also pay for make people pay for passage fees and so on and so forth. Thirdly, China controls a bunch of rare earth minerals, for example, in Upper Mongolia. These are key for the high-tech industries that open government wants to talk about. If China can put tariffs on this cripples our high-tech industry because we are based on that, like Silicon Valley, like closing government talks about, far more than our tariffs cripple China. Fourthly, China is not a democracy. In the United States of America, when the economic like business interests in America that are hit by tariffs on China because China is retaliating, when they lobby against this, when they say, well, they will not fund your campaigns if you keep this up, if the people are dissatisfied, there's a disincentive to keep it up. Whereas the Chinese Communist Party does not like respond to any kind of democratic interest, which means they can keep this up indefinitely because they have less of checks and balances. Fifthly, China has other trading partners. The EU is still trading with China despite American sanctions. Sixthly, China is incredibly competitive because China has economies of scale. They can mass produce cheap exports, which then price dump on European and Western markets, which means they get the money and the flow of the GDP into their country. But secondly, given that their state subsidizes their export, this means that the prices of their exports are incredibly low and like they are artificially low, which European companies and Western companies cannot match, and China always has a trade advantage. Seventhly, as Ayal mentions, like COVID, China is dealing with it well. The US is only seeing the second wave. Like eighthly, China is currently having like an outburst of economic growth. We're unlikely to be able to outlast China. What does this mean? This means we are harmed by the trade war. First of all, because Chinese imports from China become more expensive when we impose tariffs. We import a lot of intermediary goods from China, which are necessary for production in our industries. Secondly, our exports to China become more expensive, given this is a new and burgeoning market and a market share we have not yet accessed. This hurts a lot of our companies whose strategy was to pivot towards the Chinese market. Thirdly, we say that like sanctions are generally bad for the economy. Fourthly, we said this policy means that less goods are available to our citizens. Fifthly, this may impact our cooperation with China in terms of COVID, like how many masks or how much technology, medicinal help they export to us. We see this generally harms the citizenry, and that's a wider harm than opening opposition. However, what we say is that given that Biden is likely to win the election, and I will prove why he is, that the trade war is likely to be stopped. But it cannot be stopped if Biden continues this policy, because in order to be consistent, you have to continue the rest of the trade war with China. Open government cannot support this policy for like 3 months. They have to support it even if Biden wins. Before I explain why he will win, OG very quickly.
Okay, so all of these are good reasons as to why China will give in, because if it's not that big a deal for them, but yet they still have interest in order to sell Huawei to the EU, then they will want to concede here, because as you point out, it's not such a huge deal. We think that it probably does more damage to them than the US, and therefore there is more likelihood of doing it. Our case isn't contingent on it.
Not a huge deal. Why would you concede to someone who is your geopolitical rival? I see no logic in this. Look, the trade war is currently a very unpopular policy because of the harms that I have mentioned, but also because we lose trade revenue, because China holds a lot of US debt, which is very pernicious. This means if Biden wins, he's more likely to want to approach China. First of all, because he wants to portray himself as different from Trump. Secondly, because we need Chinese cooperation in COVID for vaccine and technology and stuff like this. But thirdly, because China's influence is rising in Southeast Asia, we want to be on their good side. This is what Obama did as well. Why is Biden likely to win? First of all, the polls show a huge lead from Biden. He has a better strategic approach than Hillary because he's staying away from debate, letting Trump humiliate himself. Secondly, Trump is hugely failing in the COVID crisis. People's families are dying. People are losing faith. Thirdly, Trump has not delivered on his promises. The Rust Belt, which were the swing states which swung towards him, has not done that. They're still being outsourced to Bangladesh. Fourthly, Biden has been endorsed by Bernie Sanders quicker than Hillary, has appointed Kamala Harris, who is representative of the African-American community and is more likely to garner votes. But fifthly, he capitalized on the Obama bromance, right, and the reputation of the Obama administration. Given he's likely to win this election, and I expect he will be less strict on China, this means less trade war, this means less harms on our citizens, this means closing opposition wins the debate.
I thank the opposition member and welcome the government whip. Whip and welcome the opposition whip.
Cool. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Awesome. A few seconds. Cool. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, let's know the closing government does not respond to this extension at all. So let's completely dive into it and also compare ourselves directly to opening up and see why we take over on that triangle, then deal with both governments later. Firstly, what didn't prove to you why Biden would necessarily win the elections and why this is crucially then important on the comparative as to where do we actually get trade or where it gets worse, right? I think it gives you numerous reasons to why this is actually going to happen. The first one is Biden is obviously massively leading in polls for reasons such as that Trump didn't deliver on his promises, right? The Rust Belt, where he actually was constantly running with this farmer American narrative and his promise to open up jobs, and look, well, he didn't, and people are very disappointed in, the only people that actually believed in Trump are at this point disappointed. Biden makes less mistakes in campaigns because he doesn't actually show up so much in media. He likes to humiliate himself or have people point out stupid shit that he said, just like Hillary did 4 years ago. He also has Kamala Harris represent the people of color, and also has Biden's endorsement, right? I think that after all of these reasons, we can have a very fair assumption that Biden is most likely going to win elections that didn't spend lots of time with was never taken down. Now, why is this necessarily crucial? Because what OO tells you here is that US is vulnerable, exposed to backlash, and we don't know what's going to happen in elections. Not only do we actually prove what's going to happen to elections, but then outlines to why it will be harmful, but more importantly, why Biden is on the comparative more likely to stop the trade war with China for numerous reasons. The first one of which is that he wants to differentiate from Trump because Trump's anti-China approach was actually futile, and even though we were imposing tax sanctions on China, well, nothing actually happened to China. No, it also didn't bring, I think, 5 reasons as to why it happened to China, which is China is much, much stronger than anything that US can actually offer, but that is another thing, right? Also, secondly, China is a huge US trading partner, which is obviously crucial in times of crisis where America is literally falling apart while COVID is happening, right? Also, China holds so much US debt, it could literally flood our market, take down all of our financial assets if it chooses to, right? We also probably want China's cooperation on COVID. And also, Obama had the same policy and was on good terms with CCP officials because you always want to be on good terms with them so you can have some sort of a bargaining chip, right? Where extension necessarily proves is that Biden will be most likely elected, and also that that if he were to be elected, he would probably want to pivot towards China and not actually go against it and create a huge trade war that's going to be largely harmful. But at the point where you impose this policy, this is going to be largely detrimental, right? And I think Tim covers all of these harms, right? Importing and exporting is more expensive. We have less diverse product for the people. We lose revenue from trade. Secondary sanctions because it means our companies are also checked to the ones that are in China. And note, to the extent to which this House believes debate, and we cover the most ground we can actually have with harms. At the point where one of the two largest, sort of countries in the world are at a Cold War or at a stalemate, everyone else suffers, right? Once you have this Cold War stalemate on the market and companies cannot enter each other's markets and you cannot produce the goods at the same price that you would usually, everyone probably suffers, right? So what's going to be crucial now is to completely mitigate everything that came from government, because I think it's largely assertive while dealing with closing government. Well, like actually with OG, I'll take down CG because CG is actually OG but just a bit more angry, right? So let's see what happens in the opening half of what OG tells us, right? What OG presents as an issue is that China can take conductors and remake them, right? Reverse engineering. Look, this is a marginally marginal assumption, but look what OL says. OL says, well, they bought it already, they have their own tech and a bunch of some assertive reasons, right? We agree with this assumption in general, but it misses Sara's context. OG doesn't mind that China has Huawei, but they specifically have American engineering, meaning that the majority of OL's claims about they can still do it, it doesn't actually take down why America shouldn't protect their citizens on a principle or the other harms that they actually talk about here. So let's take all of them down. So firstly, why OG has issues with that is because they probably think that they have to protect intellectual property that is owned by the company. This principle in of itself means that selling to any actor that can use your tech is problematic. OG rests on the general anti-China intuition, but realistically, most of the European companies can use those reverse engines, right? Yes, Benji, EU does have very good intellectual universities and R&D funding as well, and could use it under the table to be less dependent on the US, because that is an incentive, and it possibly could do it on the comparative, being like one of the most largest economies in the world also if they wanted to. Meaning the principle of protection is not exclusive, therefore not as relevant in this debate. Secondly, they say it's hard to locate their shipping and selling to everyone because they're so profit incentivized. If Sarah's characterization is true, they're so profit incentivized in status quo, that means that these same companies will still sell around the world to countries like Russia, Hungary, Serbia, that are autocratic and problematic for open government, meaning that they will still sell to all the other countries that share similar bad traits and can use it to push back against their own citizens or Americans, just like Russia did, meaning marginal. Spying, telecommunication throughout the world, which is also one of Sarah's issues. Look, patents, codes, and algorithms are not only traded fairly between contracts, right, and rich people, to the extent to which hackers who are working underground exist in the real world, they will still get this information because it's traded on the deep web just like everything is, or they have their own ways of communication. They don't meet up on boards and discuss prices. American hackers who are so well educated and don't work for Google can easily get this tech infrastructure and sell to the highest bidder, which is probably China, because China, obviously, as everyone agrees here, spies in the US is probably going to be the highest bidder, or their CCP hackers will probably be the highest bidder, meaning that, yes, specifically American codes that OG so much cares about still actually are being sold to other countries. And look, they have all of the other issues with selling to other countries. Look, China is connected to 70 countries through BRI that covers 30% of the world's GDP. And they're the most sustainable state on the markets. All of your benefits are marginal, and you have specifically American patents still sold, and also you still spy on your citizens, both governments, like everything that Tim talks about, Facebook, etc. So should that any principle not being completely spying, we're spying on anyone, please. I'm not sure that you change anything or that China won't be able to sell. This is very, very crucial in why you cannot engage in trade war. It should not take any of the governments. China's economy is in no way primarily ever tied to American tech engines. Look, InfoSlide says that the tech engines are bought majorly from the US. Great, but that is only one part of China's GDP. BRI is to the Mediterranean and the EU states. They earn massive amounts of money on taxing the infrastructure from Myanmar, Cambodia, Indonesia, ports, factories, countries dependent on them. Also, one of the most sustainable economies in the world because they turn so much money on selling their own products to their own fucking citizens, food, toys, etc. Also, 3/4 of circulating US dollars go through Hong Kong that they're actually cracking down on currently, and their own institutions. Also, minerals that Tim talks about. Tech was never their main that was never the main source of actually having the entire country stable, right? This means this won't cripple them. We will not have any concessions, right? This analysis also takes out OG's concessions, since they won't obviously affect China. There's no way that US is ever going to have leverage on them, but it's a significant part of our extension, where you're never going to win the trade war. And after we prove to you that Biden definitely has incentives to actually stop, and you're going to get more benefits, not only from the US, or not on practical and practical level for everyone, but when governments are completely marginal, please be rational. Please vote for closing opposition.
Thank the opposition whip and everyone for the debate. This is a silent round, so there'll be no oral adjudication. So if you can all just leave the breakout room